It starts in the smallest, most humiliating way. A phone lit up in the dark. A name you know too well. A message that is not there. Just the empty screen, the clock, your own reflection faintly cut into the glass. And somehow that silence has weight. It sits in your chest like a hand. You tell yourself you are fine, that you are not waiting, that you have other things to do, but your body does not believe you. Your body still turns toward the door. Your mind still checks the same place. Your thoughts still circle the same person, as if the answer might finally appear if you think hard enough. That is how longing begins to change shape. At first it feels innocent, tender even. You miss someone. You remember their voice. You replay a conversation. You wonder what they meant by that one look, that one pause, that one half-finished sentence. You tell yourself it is only love, only attachment, only the normal ache of wanting someone who is not fully there. But there is another threshold, quieter and more dangerous. A point where longing stops being a feeling and becomes a room you cannot leave. A point where the mind starts feeding on absence. A point where the person is no longer simply missed, but mentally enlarged, emotionally charged, and turned into something far bigger than they ever were in the living world. That is where the shadow enters. Carl Jung understood that the parts of ourselves we refuse to face do not disappear. They go underground. They collect energy. They wait. And when they return, they rarely come back in a polite form. They come back disguised as obsession, fixation, fantasy, compulsion, endless analysis, and the strange inability to let go of someone who is no longer giving you anything real to hold. You may think you are thinking about them. Often you are actually meeting yourself. This is the part most people do not want to hear, because it feels less romantic. It is easier to believe the other person has some mysterious power over your heart. It is easier to say, "I just care too much," or "I can't stop thinking about them," or "This connection is different." And sometimes the feeling is real. Sometimes there is a real bond, a real history, a real wound. But obsession is not proof of depth. Sometimes obsession is proof of an unhealed place in you that has found a face to wear. The shadow does that. It takes what is unowned, what is unlived, what is denied, and it projects it outward. It finds a person, a memory, a fantasy, a possibility, and it makes that person carry the weight of your hunger for love, your hunger for safety, your hunger to matter, your hunger to be chosen, seen, held, understood, finally, without having to explain yourself again and again. And because the unconscious loves symbols more than logic, it does not say, "You are hungry for wholeness." It says, "You need them." So you call it longing. But the deeper truth is that longing can become a mask for a split inside the psyche. A split between the part of you that wants peace and the part of you that cannot tolerate emptiness. A split between the self that knows better and the shadow that would rather chase a fantasy than sit alone with the ache underneath it. You can feel this in the body before you can explain it in words. The restless scrolling, the sudden urge to check if they viewed your story, the way a deleted message can feel louder than a sent one, the way one unread notification can hijack your entire nervous system, the way you can be physically present in a room and still emotionally standing outside a locked door, listening for footsteps that may never come. That is not just desire, that is psychic tension. And tension, when it is not understood, seeks an object. The mind starts building a private mythology. You remember the good moments more vividly than they deserve. You edit out the confusion. You turn mixed signals into hidden meaning. You turn silence into a puzzle. You turn a person into a symbol. And symbols are powerful because the unconscious speaks through them. But symbols become dangerous when you stop reading them inwardly and start worshiping them outwardly. This is where projection becomes obsession. Projection is one of those words people hear often and still misunderstand. It does not mean nothing was real. It does not mean you invented everything. It means that the psyche is doing something more complicated than simple observation. It means you are not only seeing the person in front of you, you are also seeing an image from inside yourself, an image charged by old needs, old wounds, old hopes, old fears. You are meeting the outer person and your inner story at the same time, and if you do not know the difference, the inner story will quietly take over. That is how someone becomes larger in your mind after they have become smaller in your life. That is how a brief exchange can echo for weeks. That is how a person who barely responds can occupy more inner space than someone who actually shows up. And if you are honest, there is usually a reason the psyche chooses this particular person. Not because they are magical, not because fate has guaranteed anything, but because they touch a place in you that was already waiting to be touched. Sometimes they fit a pattern. Sometimes they resemble an old absence. Sometimes they awaken an old wound of not being chosen, not being enough, not being fully received. Sometimes they trigger the part of you that learned very early that love must be earned, that attention must be chased, that presence must be secured before it disappears. The shadow loves old instructions. It says, try harder. It says, if you understand them enough, you will finally feel safe. It says, if you just become more patient, more beautiful, more available, more forgiving, they will stop being distant. And because these instructions are dressed in hope, they can keep a person trapped for a very long time. But here is the paradox. The more you chase what you are longing for, the less you actually encounter it. Because obsession narrows perception. It makes the world smaller. It makes your own life feel secondary. It organizes the day around another person's behavior. It hands them the center of your inner stage. And once they are on that stage, everything they do becomes meaningful. Their silence means something. Their delay means something. Their casual kindness means something. Their coldness means something. Their uncertainty means something. Their smile means something. Their absence means something. You start reading every detail like a fortune teller reading smoke. And yet the real message is usually simpler and harder. The psyche is not asking you to decode them forever. It is asking you to notice what in you is starving. Carl Jung would call this a moment where unconscious material has broken through the surface. A complex has been activated. A complex is not just a memory. It is a living knot of feeling, image, and expectation. It carries emotional charge. It pulls your attention. It reacts before your rational mind can intervene. And when a complex is activated, you do not merely think about the past. You relive its emotional atmosphere in the present. That is why one person can make you feel 10 years old again. That is why one silence can feel like an old abandonment. That is why one delayed reply can ignite a whole inner storm that seems wildly disproportionate to the actual event. The event is small, the wound is old, and the shadow, when it smells an old wound, does not stay quiet. It begins to feed. It feeds on uncertainty. It feeds on fantasy. It feeds on the possibility that this time, maybe, the story will end differently. It feeds on the hope that if you can just hold on a little longer, you will finally turn pain into proof. Proof that you were worth waiting for. Proof that the other person was secretly feeling everything. Proof that the ending has not yet happened. Proof that your suffering is meaningful because it is leading somewhere. This is how longing becomes obsession, not through love alone, but through meaning hunger. You are not only wanting the person, you are wanting the resolution. You are wanting the psyche to stop bleeding from an old place, and the shadow knows how to exploit that. It whispers through images, a text that never comes, a memory that keeps returning, a dream that leaves you unsettled in the morning, a song that feels like a message, a coincidence that feels almost too precise. The unconscious is always speaking, but not every sign means what the desperate mind wants it to mean. Sometimes the psyche is not saying, go back. Sometimes it is saying, look here. This is where you are still split. That distinction matters, because if you mistake projection for destiny, you will keep feeding the very pattern that hurts you. You will keep giving your energy to a person who may be functioning less as a partner and more as a mirror for your unlived longing, a mirror for your unfinished grief, a mirror for your hidden belief that love must be chased before it can be trusted. And the longer you stay inside that mirror, the less you see yourself. This is where the persona also enters the story. The persona is the face we learn to wear in order to be accepted, loved, admired, or at least not abandoned. For some people, the persona becomes the understanding one, the easy one, the one who does not ask for too much, the one who can wait, the one who can make excuses, the one who can hold the emotional weight for two people and still smile, the one who calls it patience when, in truth, it is self-erasure. If that is your persona, then obsession can hide inside virtue. You may tell yourself you are simply loyal. You may tell yourself you are deeply loving. You may tell yourself you are the kind of person who does not give up easily. And those things may all be partly true. But if your loyalty keeps you attached to what repeatedly diminishes you, then the persona is not serving your soul. It is protecting an old identity. It is trying to keep you safe by keeping you familiar. It would rather have you in a painful pattern than in the terrifying unknown of self-respect. Because self-respect changes everything. Once you begin to value your own peace, the old chase starts to feel embarrassing. Not because you were foolish, but because you can finally see how much of your life you handed over to a fantasy. You can finally see how many of your emotions were being organized by someone else's inconsistency. You can finally see how much power you gave to uncertainty, simply because uncertainty felt more alive than emptiness. And emptiness is one of the shadow's favorite disguises. People think obsession is always about intensity. Sometimes it is about emptiness, a quiet house, a quiet heart, a quiet evening where there is suddenly too much room for the mind to wander into old corridors. The unconscious hates a vacuum. If you do not consciously hold your own center, the shadow will rush in and populate the silence with images, stories, and compulsions. That is why the first stage of healing is often not insight, but interruption. You interrupt the loop. You stop feeding the image. You stop checking the door every 5 minutes. You stop treating every internal surge as a message you must obey. You begin to recognize the difference between a feeling and a command. That difference is everything. A feeling can be witnessed. A command must be questioned. And obsession often begins when a feeling is mistaken for truth. The ache feels like fate. The longing feels like intuition. The fear of losing them feels like evidence that they matter more than anyone else ever could. But fear is not always wisdom. Sometimes fear is a complex speaking in the voice of urgency. The deeper truth is uncomfortable. What you call missing them may also be your psyche demanding that you stop missing yourself. That is the turning point. Because once you hear that, the whole dynamic changes. You begin to ask different questions. Not, why are they like this? But, why does this particular distance grip me so hard? Not, what do they feel? But, what in me is being activated here? Not, how do I get them back? But, what part of me keeps believing I need to be chosen in order to be whole? These questions are not soft. They can sting. They can strip away fantasy. They can expose how much of your emotional life has been organized around an outer person who was never meant to carry your entire inner world. But they are also liberating because they return agency to the place where it belongs, back to you. This is not a call to become cold. It is not a call to deny love. It is not a call to shame yourself for caring. Caring is not the problem. The problem begins when caring turns into self-abandonment, when tenderness becomes dependency, when devotion becomes a way of avoiding your own inner absence. And that absence is not filled by another person's attention. It is filled by relationship with the self. In Jungian terms, the self is the deeper organizing center of the psyche, not the social mask, not the frightened ego, not the fantasy. The self is larger. It is the part of you that seeks wholeness, even when the ego wants comfort. It is the quiet intelligence underneath the chaos. And when the self begins to press for wholeness, it often does so by making old patterns unbearable. That unbearable feeling you have been trying to outrun may actually be the beginning of individuation. Individuation is not becoming perfect. It is not becoming unbreakable. It is not becoming detached in a fake, polished way. It is the slow, honest process of becoming more yourself, more whole, less split, less ruled by projections, less willing to confuse hunger with destiny. And yes, that process can feel like grief, because every projection withdrawn is a little death. The fantasy dies. The imagined future dies. The version of you who was waiting for rescue dies. The role of being the one who can endure anything dies. And something more real begins to breathe. At first, it may not feel beautiful. It may feel empty. It may feel like you have lost the very thing that made your days exciting, painful, dramatic, alive. But that intensity was often borrowed. Borrowed from anxiety, borrowed from hope, borrowed from the shadow, borrowed from the old wound of not being enough unless someone else confirms it. When you stop borrowing your life from someone else's behavior, you begin to notice your own pulse again. You notice that your thoughts are quieter. You notice that your body is no longer bracing for the next tiny signal. You notice that some of the attraction was not love in its purest form, but a compulsion to resolve an old pattern through a new person. That realization can hurt. It can also set you free. Because obsession cannot survive the light of recognition forever. It needs confusion. It needs fantasy. It needs the fog of not knowing. Once you name the mechanism, it loses some of its spell. Not all at once, not magically, but enough to create space. Space is where the psyche begins to breathe. Space is where you can feel the difference between actual affection and emotional addiction. Space is where you can ask whether what you are calling chemistry is actually an old wound recognizing a familiar shape. Space is where you can finally see that longing is not always a signal to move closer. Sometimes it is a signal to turn inward. And when you turn inward, you may find the shadow waiting there, not as an enemy, as a neglected part of you. The part that is angry you accepted crumbs. The part that is ashamed of how long you stayed. The part that still wants to be desired so badly it would rather be hurt than unseen. The part that learned to perform softness because direct need once felt dangerous. The part that turned vigilance into love. The part that kept saying, maybe this time. That part does not need punishment. It needs recognition. Because once the shadow is seen clearly, it becomes less monstrous. It may still be intense. It may still be uncomfortable. But it is no longer running the whole house from the basement. You can hear it now. You can speak to it. You can understand why it clung so hard to a person who never fully held you. You can understand that it was not only about them. It was about the old psychic arrangement that made their uncertainty feel more familiar than real stability. And that is a painful discovery for many people. Because real love is often quieter than obsession. Real love does not always come with adrenaline. Real love does not always force you to decode every silence. Real love does not make your nervous system feel like a battlefield. But the shadow often confuses intensity with truth, because intensity is easy to feel. It is dramatic. It is alive. It gives the ego a story. Stability, by contrast, can feel almost boring at first to someone whose inner world has been shaped by emotional unpredictability. That is why many people keep choosing what hurts. Not because they are weak, because their psyche has been trained to recognize pain as familiarity. This is where the work becomes deeply human. You do not shame the part of you that became attached. You do not mock the part that hoped. You do not pretend you were above it all. You look at the pattern with enough honesty to stop feeding it. You understand that the shadow turned longing into obsession, because the longing was never fully owned. It was exiled. It was hidden. It was placed on another person, so you would not have to feel the raw truth of your own unmet needs. And once you see that, you can begin to reclaim those needs without worshiping the object that triggered them. That is maturity. Not numbness, not cynicism, maturity. The ability to say, I wanted love, and I attached that wanting to a person who could not or would not meet me fully. I see that now. I do not need to keep punishing myself by pretending otherwise. If this names something you have never been able to say out loud, write a single sentence for yourself somewhere tonight. Just one sentence, not for anyone else, for the part of you that has been carrying this quietly. Because naming is a form of return, and return is how obsession begins to loosen. You may still think of them sometimes. Of course you will. The mind does not erase attachment by command. But thinking is not the same as being ruled. A memory is not a mandate. A longing is not a prophecy. A symbol is not a contract. The unconscious can speak without controlling you if you learn to listen without obeying every image it sends. That is the real invitation here. Not to kill longing, to educate it, to teach it where to go, to bring it back from the outer projection into the inner life where it belongs. Because beneath the obsession, there is often a deeper wish that has nothing to do with one specific person. The wish to be safe in your own skin, the wish to be chosen without performing, the wish to be seen without shrinking, the wish to love without losing yourself, the wish to have a heart that can open without handing over its center. That wish is not pathetic. It is sacred. But it cannot be fulfilled by chasing a shadow on the wall. It has to be met through relationship with reality. Reality may be quieter than fantasy, but it is kinder in the long run. Reality tells you what is actually happening, not what you hope is happening. Reality tells you whether someone is present, consistent, and available. Reality tells you whether your nervous system is expanding or collapsing. Reality tells you whether this connection is nourishing your soul or draining it into a loop of anticipation and regret. And once you start respecting reality, the shadow loses some of its power. Not because the shadow disappears, it never disappears completely, but because it is no longer the only voice in the room. There is also your awareness now. There is also your boundary. There is also your capacity to pause before you reach for the phone. There is also your ability to sit with the empty chair and not immediately fill it with fantasy. There is also your willingness to let silence be silence. That may sound small, but it is not small at all. A person who can tolerate silence without collapsing into projection has begun to grow a stronger center. A person who can feel longing without turning it into a chase has begun to separate love from compulsion. A person who can notice the shadow without obeying it has begun the real work of individuation. And this work changes how you move through relationships too. You stop asking other people to rescue you from your own unowned places. You stop making them responsible for your worth. You stop treating inconsistency like mystery. You stop confusing emotional intensity with depth. You stop calling a wound a soulmate just because it feels familiar. You begin to choose from a more grounded place, even if that place is still tender, especially if it is tender. Tenderness with awareness is far more powerful than obsession with hope. Because tenderness with awareness can hold grief without turning it into fantasy. It can say, I loved deeply. It can say, I projected too. It can say, I was hungry. It can say, I am learning. And learning is what the shadow ultimately wants from you. Not humiliation, not self-hatred, not endless punishment. Learning, integration. The ability to take back the energy that was locked inside the chase and use it to build a life that does not collapse when one person stays silent. That is how longing becomes wisdom, not by being denied, by being seen, by being understood as a signal from the psyche rather than a command from fate, by being brought out of the dark room and into the light where it can be named honestly. There is something very quiet that happens when this shift begins. The phone still exists. The message still may or may not come. The other person may remain the same, but inside you, something has changed. The waiting loses its authority. The fantasy loses its sweetness. The loop becomes visible, and visibility is the beginning of freedom. You may even notice a strange calm in the middle of the grief. Not because you no longer care, because you no longer need the obsession to tell you that your feelings are real. They are real, and they are yours. That is enough. You do not need to turn them into a prison. You do not need to turn another human being into a shrine. You do not need to keep feeding a projection just because it once helped you survive a deeper loneliness. You can honor the longing and still step back from the pattern that feeds on it. And if tonight the screen stays dark, if the silence remains, if the old urge rises again, remember this. The shadow turns longing into obsession when it is left unrecognized. But once recognized, it can become something else. It can become a teacher, a difficult one, yes, a humiliating one sometimes, but a teacher nonetheless. It can show you where you have been abandoning yourself. It can show you what you have been asking a stranger to carry. It can show you the exact place where your heart is ready to grow beyond compulsion. So let the phone rest. Let the mirror hold your face without judgment. Let the empty chair remain empty for a moment without becoming a story. Let the longing be a wave, not a verdict. And let the part of you that has been chasing finally hear a different voice. The one that says you do not have to disappear into someone else to feel alive. You are allowed to come back to yourself. You are allowed to want love without losing your center. You are allowed to see the shadow clearly and still choose dignity. You are allowed to let the obsession end, not in bitterness, but in recognition. My silence is not a game. It is my return to myself. And when you can say that with honesty, even softly, the room changes. The body softens. The inner door opens a little. The unconscious, which once turned longing into obsession, begins to turn it into understanding. Not overnight, but enough. Enough to breathe, enough to see, enough to begin again from a place that is finally yours.